The distant wail of a coyote echoed across the vast Montana plains as Josephine Valmont clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, watching the approaching storm clouds with growing unease. The year was 1876, and life on the frontier was as unforgiving as the land itself. Lightning split the darkening sky, illuminating her modest cabin with an eerie glow. "Not tonight," she whispered to herself, hurrying to secure the last of her livestock in the small barn adjacent to her homestead. At 24, Josie had already endured more hardship than most women twice her age. Widowed last winter when influenza claimed her husband, she had somehow managed to keep their small ranch running through sheer determination. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain, and something acrid that made her heart race. Smoke. Turning toward her cabin, Josie saw the first flickering flames licking up the side of her home, feeding on the dry timber like a ravenous beast. A bolt of lightning must have struck while she was in the barn. "No!" she screamed, running toward the cabin, but the flames spread with terrifying speed. Within minutes, the fire had swallowed half the structure, the heat so intense it forced her back. Everything she owned was inside her few precious belongings, the photograph of her parents, her husband's pocket watch. Her entire life was being consumed before her eyes. Tears streamed down her face as she watched helplessly. The fire had almost entirely engulfed the cabin when she remembered her father's rifle and the lockbox containing her meager savings were still inside. Without thinking, she ran toward the burning structure. The heat hit her like a physical blow as she reached the door, flames dancing around the entrance. Josie took a deep breath and plunged inside, immediately overcome by thick, choking smoke. She dropped to her knees, crawling toward the bed where she kept the lockbox. The cabin groaned ominously around her as timbers shifted and cracked. Josie's lungs burned, her eyes watered so badly she could barely see. Her fingers closed around the metal box just as a beam crashed down nearby, sending a shower of sparks across the room and igniting the curtains. She was trapped. The main entrance was now completely blocked by flames, and the smoke was getting thicker by the second. Josie clutched the box to her chest, coughing violently as she tried to find another way out. The window, it was her only chance. Just as she staggered toward it, the roof began to collapse. Her legs gave out, and she fell to the floor, consciousness slipping away as the smoke filled her lungs. Through the roar of the flames, she heard the sound of breaking glass, and then strong arms were around her. A deep voice cut through her fading awareness. "I've got you," the voice said, and she felt herself being lifted. The last thing Josephine heard before darkness claimed her was a determined declaration, "Then I'll carry her through the smoke." When Josie awoke, she was lying on a bedroll beneath the stars, the smell of coffee mingling with the lingering scent of smoke in her nostrils. She bolted upright, immediately regretting it as a painful coughing fit racked her body. "Easy there," came a low, gentle voice. "Your lungs took quite a beating." She turned to see a man crouched beside a small campfire. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a weather-beaten face and kind eyes, he wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy: denim pants, a faded cotton shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that sat beside him on the ground. "My cabin," she rasped, her throat raw from smoke. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "It's gone." Fresh tears welled in her eyes. "Everything I had." The cowboy moved closer, offering her a tin cup of water. "Not everything. I managed to get this out." He nodded toward her father's lockbox resting safely beside her bedroll. "And the animals are fine. I released them from the barn before it caught." Relief flooded through her, followed quickly by gratitude. "You saved my life." "Thank you, Mr. Jackson Kane," he replied with a slight nod. "Most folks just call me Jack." "Josephine Valmont," she offered in return. "Josie." "Well, Miss Valmont, you're lucky. I was passing through. Saw the smoke and fire from the ridge." His expression grew serious. What were you thinking? Running back into a burning building? It's all I have left, she said defensively, her hand moving protectively to the lockbox. After my husband died. You're a widow? Jack interrupted, surprise evident in his voice. She nodded, suddenly aware of her vulnerable position alone in the wilderness with a stranger. But something about Jackson Kane's steady gaze reassured her. There was honor written in the lines of his face. I'm sorry for your loss, he said with genuine sympathy. Been on your own long? Since last winter. Josie took a careful sip of water, the cool liquid soothing her raw throat. Thomas, my husband, we came west 3 years ago. Had big dreams of building a cattle ranch. She smiled sadly. The land had other ideas. Jack nodded, understanding in his eyes. He'd seen many dreams broken against the harsh realities of frontier life. What will you do now? The question hit her like a physical blow. What would she do? The cabin was gone, and while she had her savings and the livestock, it wouldn't be enough to rebuild before winter. I don't know, she admitted, her voice small. The nearest town is Silver Creek, about 15 miles south. I have an acquaintance there, the schoolteacher, Miss Bedford. Perhaps she could offer shelter until I. She trailed off, the enormity of her situation overwhelming her. Jackson studied her thoughtfully. I've got a small spread about a day's ride from here. Nothing fancy, but I've built up a decent herd. I'm heading to Silver Creek myself to pick up supplies. I can take you there. Josie hesitated, weighing her limited options. She barely knew this man, but he had risked his life to save hers. And the alternative was to walk 15 miles to town, alone and weakened from smoke inhalation. Thank you, Mr. Kane. I'd be grateful for the escort. Just Jack, he corrected with a small smile. Get some rest now. We'll head out at first light. As Josie settled back onto the bedroll, exhaustion quickly overtaking her, she couldn't help but notice how the firelight played across Jack's features, softening the weathered lines of his face. There was something both comforting and unsettling about his presence, like the approaching storm that had preceded the disaster, powerful and unpredictable. Morning came with a gentle touch on her shoulder. Jack had already packed his gear and saddled his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion. Behind it stood Josie's own mare, somehow retrieved from where it had fled during the fire. You found Penny, she exclaimed, genuine joy in her voice as she stroked the mare's velvety nose. She didn't wander far. Animals are smarter than people give them credit for. Jack handed her a tin cup of coffee and some jerky. It's not much of a breakfast, but it'll keep you going until we reach town. As they ate, Josie studied her rescuer more carefully in the clear morning light. He was older than she had first thought, perhaps in his early 30s. His dark hair was streaked with the occasional strand of silver at the temples, and a thin scar ran along his jawline. His hands were those of a working man, strong, calloused, capable. But it was his eyes that drew her attention most, a deep blue that reminded her of mountain lakes, watchful and intelligent. How long have you been in Montana Territory? She asked, curious about the man who had saved her life. Going on 5 years now, Jack replied, his gaze scanning the horizon as he spoke. Came north after the war, looking for a fresh start. You fought in the war between the states? Josie asked, suddenly understanding the quiet vigilance in his bearing. Jack nodded, his expression growing distant. Union cavalry. Saw things no man should have to see. He shook his head slightly, as if dislodging unwelcome memories. Afterward, I couldn't settle back into Virginia farm life. Too many ghosts. Josie understood that feeling all too well. After Thomas died, every corner of their cabin had held some memory, some reminder of what she had lost. Now those physical reminders were gone, reduced to ashes, and she wasn't sure if that was a blessing or yet another loss to mourn. I think we all carry our ghosts with us, she said softly. Jack looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing something beyond her smoke-stained clothes and tangled hair. Something like respect flickered in his eyes. "That we do, Miss Valmont. That we do." They set out as the sun climbed higher in the sky, riding side by side across the rolling prairie. Jack kept a steady pace, mindful of Josie's condition. Every so often, a coughing fit would overtake her, and he would stop, offering her his canteen without comment. By midday, the landscape had changed from open grassland to scattered pine forest. The temperature dropped slightly as they entered the shade of the trees, a welcome relief from the summer heat. "We'll rest here a while," Jack announced, dismounting beside a small creek. "Let the horses drink." Josie slid from her saddle, wincing as her muscles protested the movement. She hadn't ridden in months, and her body was reminding her of that fact with every step. Jack pretended not to notice her discomfort, allowing her to maintain her dignity. As they sat beside the creek, sharing the simple provisions Jack carried in his saddlebags, Josie found herself studying his profile. There was a quietness to him that she found oddly comforting. He didn't feel the need to fill the silence with empty words, unlike many men she'd known. "May I ask where you learned to ride like that?" she asked, noticing the easy grace with which he handled his horse. "Was it during the war?" Jack shook his head. "Been riding since before I could walk. My father raised horses back in Virginia, best horseman I ever knew." A rare smile crossed his face. He could gentle the wildest Mustang with nothing more than patience and respect. "Is he still in Virginia?" "No," Jack said quietly. "Lost him in '63. Gettysburg." Josie's hand instinctively reached out to touch his arm, a gesture of sympathy. "I'm sorry." Jack looked down at her hand, then up at her face. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition of shared loss, of understanding without words. He cleared his throat. "We should get moving if we want to reach Silver Creek before dark." The remainder of their journey passed with comfortable conversation interspersed with periods of companionable silence. Jack pointed out landmarks, sharing bits of knowledge about the territory that revealed his deep connection to the land. Josie found herself drawn to his quiet confidence, the way he seemed at home in this wild country. As the afternoon waned, they crested a ridge, and Silver Creek spread out below them, a small but growing frontier town nestled in a valley, with a main street lined with wooden buildings and scattered houses spreading outward. "Not much to look at," Jack commented, "but they've got a decent general store, a sawmill, and even a schoolhouse now. Town's growing." Josie felt a mix of relief and apprehension as they approached. Relief to reach civilization, but apprehension about what would come next. Her entire life had been upended in a single night, and the path forward remained unclear. They rode down the main street, attracting curious glances from townspeople going about their evening business. Josie was acutely aware of her disheveled appearance, her dress still bearing the traces of ash and smoke. Jack seemed oblivious to the stares, his focus on guiding them toward a modest two-story building with a sign identifying it as Widow Harlow's boarding house. "Martha Harlow's a good woman," Jack explained as they dismounted. "She'll give you a fair price for a room, and she doesn't tolerate gossip under her roof." Josie felt a rush of gratitude. Of course, he would understand her concerns about propriety and reputation in a small town. Inside, they were greeted by a plump, gray-haired woman with a no-nonsense manner that softened when Jack explained Josie's situation. Widow Harlow clucked sympathetically and immediately offered her best available room. "You poor dear," she said, looking Josie over with motherly concern. "A fire is a terrible thing. You'll stay here as long as you need, and we'll figure out the payment later." "That's very kind, Mrs. Harlow, but I can pay," Josie insisted, retrieving her lockbox. "I managed to save this, at least." Jack cleared his throat. "I'll see to your mare, Miss Valmont. Get her settled at the livery stable." Josie turned to him, suddenly realizing this might be goodbye. The thought left her feeling strangely bereft. Mr. Kane, Jack, I don't know how to thank you. He shifted uncomfortably under her grateful gaze. No need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same. No, she said firmly. Not anyone would have run into a burning building for a stranger. Something flashed in his eyes, an emotion she couldn't quite name. He touched the brim of his hat in a small salute. I'll check on you tomorrow. Make sure you're settling in all right. With that, he turned and left, his tall figure silhouetted against the fading daylight as he led both horses toward the livery. Widow Harlow watched him go with knowing eyes. That's a good man there, Miss Valmont. Known Jack Kane for 3 years now, and I've never seen him take such an interest in anyone's welfare before. Josie felt a flush creep up her neck. He saved my life. I'm sure he feels responsible. The older woman merely smiled. Of course, dear. Now, let's get you upstairs. You look dead on your feet, and I've got a hot bath and clean clothes that should fit you well enough until we can sort out something more permanent. The bath was heaven, the first moment of pure pleasure Josie had experienced since watching her home burn. As she sank into the warm water, scrubbing away the soot and ash from her skin, she found her thoughts returning to Jackson Kane. There was something compelling about him, beyond his handsome features and the heroic circumstances of their meeting. A depth of character, a solidity that was rare in this transient frontier world. But she quickly pushed such thoughts aside. She was still in mourning for Thomas, still trying to build a life from the ashes of her dreams. Romantic notions were a luxury she could ill afford. After changing into the borrowed nightgown, Josie opened the window of her small room, letting in the evening breeze. Below, Silver Creek was settling into nighttime routines, lamps being lit, saloon doors swinging open and closed, the occasional burst of laughter drifting upward. From this vantage point, it looked almost picturesque, like the illustrations in the dime novels she'd read as a girl. She sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing herself to fully comprehend everything she had lost. The cabin had been modest, but it had been hers, a home built with Thomas, filled with memories both bitter and sweet. Now it was gone, along with most of her possessions. All she had left were the clothes on her back, her mare, and the contents of the lockbox, about $60 in cash, and a few pieces of her mother's jewelry. It wasn't much to rebuild a life on, but it would have to be enough. A soft knock at her door roused her from these melancholy thoughts. Widow Harlow stood there with a tray bearing a steaming bowl of stew and freshly baked bread. Thought you might be hungry, dear, she said, setting the tray on a small table. And I've spoken with Jane Bedford, the schoolteacher. She's eager to see you tomorrow. Seems you two exchanged letters. Josie nodded. Yes, we've corresponded since I inquired about school books last year. I was teaching myself to improve my reading. Widow Harlow smiled approvingly. Education is never wasted. Jane's a lovely young woman, came out from Boston last year. She's boarding with the minister and his wife, but she spends most evenings here, helping me with the bookkeeping in exchange for supper. After the older woman left, Josie ate hungrily, realizing she'd had nothing substantial since before the fire. The stew was rich and flavorful, the bread still warm from the oven. Simple comfort food, but it lifted her spirits immeasurably. Her last thought before drifting into an exhausted sleep was of Jack's promise to check on her tomorrow. Despite everything, she found herself looking forward to seeing him again. Morning brought clarity and purpose. Josie woke determined to take control of her situation rather than wallow in misfortune. After breakfast with Widow Harlow, she ventured out to explore Silver Creek, wearing a borrowed dress that was slightly too large but clean and respectable. The town was busier than it had appeared the previous evening. Wagons rolled down the main street, cowboys lounged outside the saloon, and women moved purposefully between the general store and other businesses. It was a typical frontier town, rough around the edges but with signs of permanence and growth, new construction, painted storefronts, even a small park where children played. Josie's first stop was the general store, where she purchased a few necessities using a small portion of her savings. The shopkeeper, a friendly man named Mr. Simmons, expressed sympathy when she explained her circumstances. "Terrible thing, losing your home like that," he said, carefully wrapping her purchases in brown paper. "But you're welcome in Silver Creek, Mrs. Valmont. We're a growing community. Always room for hardworking folks." "Thank you," she replied, touched by his kindness. "I'm not sure yet if I'll stay, but it's good to know I'd be welcome." As she stepped out of the store, she nearly collided with Jack, who was just coming up the boardwalk. He steadied her with a hand on her elbow, and Josie felt a curious flutter in her chest at the contact. "Miss Valmont," he said, tipping his hat. "You're looking better today." "Amazing what a bath and a good night's sleep can do," she replied with a smile. "Though I'm afraid I'll be in Mrs. Harlow's debt for some time with all her kindness." Jack's expression grew serious. "Actually, that's part of what I wanted to discuss with you. Do you have time for coffee?" Intrigued, Josie nodded, and he led her to a small cafe adjacent to the hotel. It was a modest establishment but clean and well-kept, with checkered tablecloths and curtains at the windows, attempts at gentility in the rugged frontier setting. Once they were seated with steaming cups before them, Jack seemed to struggle for words, uncharacteristically hesitant. "I rode out to your property this morning," he finally said. "Wanted to see if anything could be salvaged." Josie's heart clenched. "And the cabin's a total loss," he confirmed gently. "But your root cellar survived intact. I brought back what I could." He nodded toward his horse, visible through the window with several canvas bags tied to the saddle. Some preserved food, tools, a few books that were stored in a metal trunk. Tears pricked at Josie's eyes. She hadn't expected to recover anything. "Thank you. That's more than I hoped for." Jack shifted uncomfortably, turning his coffee cup between his hands. "There's something else. I've been thinking about your situation." She braced herself, unsure what was coming. "My property, it's a good piece of land, about 50 acres with water rights to Connors Creek. I've built it up some over the years, got a small herd of cattle, a decent cabin. But I've been on my own, and there's only so much one man can do." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I've been thinking about taking on a partner." Josie stared at him, not quite comprehending. "A partner?" "A business partner," he clarified hastily. "You mentioned your husband had dreams of ranching. I thought perhaps you might consider investing what you have left in my operation. In return, you'd have a place to live, a share of the profits." He hurried on, clearly concerned she might misinterpret. "There's a small second cabin on the property. It needs work, but it would be yours. You'd have your independence." Stunned, Josie took a moment to process his offer. It was unexpected but not unwelcome. She had been wondering how to move forward, and the prospect of starting completely from scratch had been daunting. "That's extremely generous," she said carefully. "But why would you make such an offer to someone you barely know?" Jack met her gaze steadily. "I'm a good judge of character, Miss Valmont. You survived out there on your own after your husband passed. That tells me you're resilient and hardworking. Those are qualities I respect." He paused. "And to be perfectly honest, I could use the help. Ranching alone is a hard life." Something in his straightforward manner convinced her of his sincerity. This wasn't charity or pity, it was a practical proposition that could benefit them both. "I would need to think about it," she said. "It's a significant decision." "Of course," he agreed. "I'll be in town for 2 days, gathering supplies. Take your time." Their conversation turned to other matters than the prospects for rain, the price of beef, the growth of Silver Creek. Josie found herself enjoying his company, appreciating his dry humor and thoughtful observations. Jack Kane wasn't a man of many words, but those he chose were meaningful. As they parted outside the cafe, he hesitated, then said, "I meant what I said about the partnership, Miss Valmont. But even if you decide against it, I'd be happy to help you rebuild wherever you choose. His offer touched her deeply. You've already done more than enough, Mr. Kane. Jack, he reminded her with a ghost of a smile. Jack, she echoed, and the name felt right on her lips. Later that afternoon, Josie met with Jane Bedford, the schoolteacher, a vivacious young woman with intelligence shining in her gray eyes. They had corresponded for nearly a year, but this was their first face-to-face meeting. "Oh, Josie, I was so distressed to hear about your cabin," Jane exclaimed, clasping Josie's hands warmly. "What a dreadful ordeal. You must stay with the minister and his wife. They have a spare room they've been looking to let." "That's very kind," Josie replied, "but I may have another option." Hesitantly, she shared Jack's proposition. Jane's eyebrows rose. "Jackson Kane made you an offer of partnership? My goodness." She looked thoughtful. "He has a reputation as a solitary man, keeps to himself mostly, though he's well respected. They say he's one of the best ranchers in the territory, despite working alone. What else do you know about him?" Josie asked, trying to sound merely curious rather than eager. Jane's eyes twinkled knowingly. "He came here about 5 years ago, bought land that everyone said was worthless, and turned it into one of the most prosperous small ranches in the county. He's fair in his dealings, pays his debts promptly, and never causes trouble." She leaned closer. "And half the unmarried women in Silver Creek have set their caps for him, without success." "It's not like that," Josie protested, feeling her cheeks warm. "It's purely a business arrangement he's suggesting." "Of course," Jane agreed, though her smile suggested otherwise. "Still, it's a generous offer. And practical, too. Starting over completely would be difficult, especially with winter coming in a few months." That evening, as Josie sat alone in her boarding house room, she carefully considered her options. She could stay in Silver Creek, perhaps take a position as a housekeeper or seamstress. Jane had also mentioned the possibility of assisting at the school. Or she could try to rebuild on her own land, though that would deplete her savings entirely and leave her vulnerable if the crops failed again. Or she could accept Jack's offer. A partnership with separate living quarters but shared work and profit. It was unconventional, to be sure, but then again, conventional thinking had limited application on the frontier. Josie opened her lockbox, running her fingers over the few treasures inside. Thomas's pocket watch, her mother's cameo, her father's worn Bible. The physical remnants of her past were few, but the lessons they had taught her remained. Her father had always said, "Sometimes the bravest thing is to accept help when it's offered." By morning, she had made her decision. She found Jack at the livery stable, checking the shoes on his stallion. He straightened when he saw her approach, his expression carefully neutral. "I've been thinking about your offer," Josie began without preamble. He nodded, waiting. "I'd like to accept, with one condition." She squared her shoulders. "I want a written agreement, stating clearly that it's a true partnership. If I invest my savings and my labor, I want equal say in how the ranch is run." A slow smile spread across Jack's face, the first real smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his features, softening the hard lines and lighting his eyes. "I wouldn't have expected anything less, Miss Valmont." "Josie," she corrected him. "If we're to be partners, I think you should use my given name." "Josie," he repeated, and like her earlier use of his name, it felt right somehow. "I'll draw up the agreement today. We can have Silver Creek's justice of the peace witness it." They shook hands formally, and Josie felt a curious sense of rightness, as if somehow, improbably, the fire that had destroyed her home had set her on a path toward something better. 3 days later, with the agreement properly signed and her few possessions packed, Josie found herself riding beside Jack toward his ranch, now their ranch. The journey would take most of the day, and as they left Silver Creek behind, Josie felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. "Tell me more about the property," she requested as they rode. "You mentioned 50 acres?" Jack nodded. Good land, mostly. About 30 acres of grazing pasture, 10 of woodland, and 10 that could be cultivated. I focused on the cattle, so far got about 40 head, not counting the Springs calves. But the soil's decent. With some work, we could grow crops too. I'd like that, Josie said. I miss having a vegetable garden. The conversation flowed easily between them as they traveled, each sharing bits of their knowledge and experience. Josie spoke of her father's techniques for companion planting, while Jack described his methods for rotating grazing land to prevent overuse. They discovered a shared interest in horse breeding as well. My mare has good bloodlines, Josie mentioned. My father was particular about his stock. I noticed, Jack replied approvingly. She's well-formed, with strong legs and good endurance. If she passes those traits to her foals, they'd be valuable. As the day progressed, the landscape changed, becoming more varied with rolling hills and stands of pine trees. By mid-afternoon, Jack pointed toward a distant ridge. There it is, Connors Valley. Our ranch is just beyond that line of trees. Our ranch. The word sent a curious thrill through Josie. It had been a long time since she had belonged somewhere, been part of something larger than her solitary struggle to survive. They crested the ridge, and the valley opened up before them, a picturesque sweep of land with a creek winding through it, shimmering in the late afternoon sun. Cattle dotted the landscape, grazing peacefully on lush grass. In the distance, a modest cabin stood beside a cluster of outbuildings, smoke curling from the chimney. It's beautiful, Josie breathed. Pretty good piece of land, Jack agreed, but she could hear the pride in his voice. Not what most folks would call spectacular, but it's got good water, fertile soil, and enough timber for building and firewood. As they approached the cabin, a figure emerged from the barn, a young man with sandy hair who waved enthusiastically. That's Daniel Jenkins, Jack explained. Works for me part-time, mostly helping with the cattle. Good kid, about 19. His family has the neighboring property to the east. Daniel jogged over to meet them as they dismounted. Welcome back, Mr. Kane. Got everything taken care of while you were gone, just like you asked. His curious gaze shifted to Josie. Daniel, this is Miss Josephine Valmont, Jack said formally. She's my new business partner. If the young man was surprised, he hid it well. Pleasure to meet you, Miss Valmont. Welcome to Raven Ridge Ranch. Thank you, Daniel, Josie replied warmly. And please call me Josie. Jack led the way toward the main cabin, a solidly built structure of logs with a stone foundation. I'll show you around, then take you to your cabin. It's about a quarter-mile down the creek. The main house was simple but comfortable, with a large main room that served as both kitchen and living area and 2 small bedrooms off to the side. Everything was meticulously organized, reflecting Jack's military background. Josie was particularly impressed with the kitchen, which featured a proper cast iron stove rather than just a fireplace. You have a good setup here, she commented. Took time, he replied. First year, I lived in a tent while I built the cabin. He showed her the storage room, filled with supplies he'd purchased in Silver Creek. Should see us through most of the winter, though we'll need to preserve what we can from the garden. After touring the outbuildings, a sturdy barn, a smokehouse, and a toolshed, Jack led her along a well-worn path that followed the creek downstream. Around a bend, partially hidden by a grove of aspen trees, stood the second cabin. It was smaller than the main house, and as Jack had warned, in need of repair. The roof was sound, but one wall showed damage from weather, and the single window was cracked. It's not much, he said apologetically. Built it as a bunkhouse originally, but never hired enough men to need it. With some work, it could be comfortable. Josie surprised herself with her lack of disappointment. After losing everything, even this modest shelter seemed like a gift. It's a good start, she said, meaning it. The structure is solid. The rest can be fixed. Jack looked relieved. I thought we could work on it together over the next few weeks, before the fall roundup demands all our attention. He hesitated. For night, though, you can stay in the main house. I'll sleep in the barn. That's not necessary, Josie protested. I don't want to displace you. It's no trouble, he insisted. Daniel aired out the spare room yesterday. It's small, but it should serve until we get your cabin in order. As they walked back to the main house, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley and painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. A sense of peace settled over Josie, unexpected but welcome. For the first time since the fire, perhaps even since Thomas's death, she felt a glimmer of hope for the future. Over the next few weeks, a routine developed that suited them both. Mornings began early, with Jack tending to the cattle while Josie took charge of the more immediate surroundings, feeding the chickens he kept for eggs, milking the solitary cow, and beginning work on a garden plot near her cabin. After a shared midday meal, they would work together on repairing her cabin. Jack proved to be a patient teacher, showing her how to replace damaged logs and properly seal the cracks against the coming winter. Josie was a quick study, and he seemed genuinely impressed with her willingness to tackle difficult tasks. Most women I've known would balk at handling an axe, he commented one afternoon as she skillfully split logs for firewood. Most women haven't had to survive a Montana winter alone, she replied with a smile. Necessity is an excellent teacher. Their partnership functioned smoothly, with each naturally gravitating toward the tasks that suited their strengths. Jack handled the livestock and heavier labor, while Josie managed the garden, preserving food, and keeping their accounts in order. Her education, though formal schooling had ended at 16, surpassed his in mathematics and reading, while his practical knowledge of ranching far exceeded hers. As September arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn color to the aspen trees, Josie's cabin was finally ready for habitation. The walls were solid, the roof reinforced, the window replaced, and a proper stone fireplace built with Jack's guidance. They had salvaged a narrow bed frame and table from an abandoned homestead several miles away, and Jack had crafted a simple chair and shelves from pine trees he felled himself. The evening she was to move in, Jack surprised her by arriving at the main house with a package wrapped in brown paper. A cabin-warming gift, he said gruffly, clearly uncomfortable with the gesture. Josie unwrapped it carefully to find a handsome quilt in shades of blue and green. It's beautiful, she said, running her fingers over the intricate stitching. Bought it from Widow Harlow before we left Silver Creek, he explained. Thought you might want something pretty after losing so much. The thoughtfulness of the gift touched her deeply. Thank you, Jack. It's perfect. Their eyes met and held for a long moment. Something shifted between them, a current of awareness that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had been there all along, unacknowledged. Josie felt her pulse quicken, and for an instant, she thought he might step closer. Instead, he cleared his throat and looked away. Well, we should get your things moved before dark. That night, alone in her new cabin for the first time, Josie found herself thinking about Jack more than she cared to admit. She had come to respect him immensely over the past weeks, his integrity, his work ethic, his quiet strength. But there was more to it than respect, and that realization both thrilled and frightened her. It had been less than a year since Thomas died. Was it disloyal to feel this stirring of interest in another man? And even if it wasn't, there was no guarantee Jack felt the same. He had been nothing but proper in his dealings with her, careful to maintain appropriate boundaries despite their unusual living arrangement. She pulled his gift around her shoulders, taking comfort in its warmth as she gazed into the fire. Time would tell, she decided. For now, she had a home again, work that satisfied her, and a partnership that gave her security without sacrificing her independence. It was more than she had dared hope for after the fire. October brought the fall roundup, a demanding time that left little opportunity for personal reflection. Josie worked alongside Jack and Daniel, plus 3 additional hands hired temporarily for the season. The work was exhausting but rewarding as they sorted, branded, and prepared cattle for market. Josie proved her worth repeatedly during this period, demonstrating skills on horseback that surprised even Jack. Growing up on her father's farm in Ohio had taught her to ride well, and she had a natural way with animals that the hired hands quickly came to respect. "Never seen a woman handle cattle like that," commented Bill Sawyer, one of the seasonal workers, after watching Josie calmly guide a nervous calf back to its mother. "You got a gift, Miss Valmont." Jack, overhearing, nodded in agreement. "She's a natural." The pride in his voice warmed her more than any direct compliment could have. By the time the roundup was complete and the cattle selected for market had been driven to the railroad station in Silver Creek, winter was approaching rapidly. The first snow dusted the ridge tops, and mornings dawned frosty and clear. With the most demanding work of the season behind them and the hired hands departed, Jack and Josie fell into a new routine. The shorter days meant more evenings spent indoors, and they began alternating dinner invitations one night at his cabin, the next at hers. These shared meals became a highlight of Josie's days. Jack, usually reserved, gradually opened up more about his past, his childhood in Virginia, his experiences during the war, his journey west afterward. Josie, in turn, shared stories of her own life, her parents' immigrant struggles, meeting Thomas at a county fair, their decision to seek a better life in the West. One snowy evening in late November, as they sat before the fire in Josie's cabin after dinner, Jack asked about Thomas. "What was he like, your husband?" Josie considered the question carefully. "Kind, ambitious, full of dreams." She smiled at the memories. "He could spin stories about the future that made you believe anything was possible. That's why I agreed to come west with him. He made it sound like an adventure rather than a hardship." "You must miss him very much," Jack said quietly. "I do," she admitted. "But strangely, not in the way I expected." She struggled to find the right words. "When he first died, I thought the grief would crush me. And it nearly did. But over time it changed. Now I remember him with fondness rather than pain. I honor his memory by living well, I think." Jack nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's wisdom many never achieve." "Have you ever been married, Jack?" she asked, realizing she had never inquired about his personal life before. A shadow crossed his face.
"No."
"Came close once, before the war. Elizabeth was her name." He stared into the fire. "Her father didn't approve of me, thought farming was beneath her prospects. When I enlisted, he convinced her to marry a banker's son instead." "I'm sorry," Josie said softly. Jack shrugged. "It was for the best. I wasn't the same man after Gettysburg." She wouldn't have recognized what came home. Impulsively, Josie reached out and covered his hand with hers. "I think you're a good man, Jack Kane." "Whatever happened during the war, it didn't change that." He turned his hand beneath hers, their palms meeting, fingers intertwining. The simple contact sent a jolt through her, and from the way his breath caught, she knew he felt it too. For a long moment, they sat in silence, hands joined, the crackle of the fire the only sound in the cabin. Then, with obvious reluctance, Jack withdrew his hand and stood. "It's getting late. I should head back before the snow gets worse." At the door, he paused, looking down at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "Thank you, Josie. For listening. For understanding. Always," she promised, and meant it. After he left, Josie stood at the window, watching his tall figure disappear into the swirling snow. Something fundamental had shifted between them tonight, a door opening to possibilities she had scarcely allowed herself to consider. Winter settled fully over Connors Valley, bringing shorter days and long, cold nights. Jack and Josie's partnership continued to flourish, both in business and in their growing personal connection. Though neither spoke openly about their feelings, There was a new awareness in their interactions, lingering glances, casual touches that weren't entirely casual, conversations that stretched late into the evening. December brought preparations for Christmas, the first Josie would celebrate since Thomas's death. To her surprise, Jack threw himself into the festivities with unexpected enthusiasm, returning from a trip to Silver Creek with small gifts for her, including a collection of paper ornaments and colored ribbons. "Christmas was always special in my family," he explained when she commented on his excitement. "My mother believed in celebrating properly, no matter how little we had." Together, they decorated the main house, bringing in evergreen boughs and hanging the ornaments from the rafters. Josie baked special treats using carefully hoarded sugar and the last of the summer's preserved berries. On Christmas Eve, they invited Daniel and his family parents, 2 younger sisters, and a brother to join them for dinner. The small cabin was filled with laughter and conversation, the most people it had hosted since Jack built it 5 years earlier. As the evening wound down and the Jenkins family prepared to leave, Mrs. Jenkins pulled Josie aside. "It does my heart good to see this place so alive," she said warmly. "Jack's been too alone these past years. You've brought something special here, Josie." Josie flushed. "We're just business partners, Mrs. Jenkins." The older woman raised an eyebrow knowingly, but didn't contradict her. "Well, partnership or not, you've made a real home here. And that's no small thing." After their guests departed, Jack and Josie sat together before the fire, enjoying the peaceful aftermath of the gathering. "That went well," Jack commented, looking more relaxed than Josie had ever seen him. "Been a while since this place heard so many voices." "It was wonderful," Josie agreed. "The Jenkins are good people." "They are," Jack confirmed. "Been neighbors since I settled here. Daniel's father helped me raise the barn." He hesitated. "Josie, I have something for you. A Christmas gift." From behind his chair, he produced a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a red ribbon clearly saved from their decorations. Josie took it, surprised and touched. "But I thought the decorations were my gift." "Those were for the house," he said. "This is for you." Inside the package, Josie found a small, leather-bound journal with her initials embossed on the cover in gold. "Oh, Jack, it's beautiful. You mentioned once that you used to keep a journal before the fire," he explained. "Thought you might want to start again." The thoughtfulness of the gift brought tears to her eyes. "I love it. Thank you." She reached beneath the sofa and pulled out her own hidden gift. "I have something for you, too." Jack unwrapped the package carefully to reveal a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool, a project Josie had been working on secretly for weeks, using yarn purchased in Silver Creek. "You made this?" he asked, running his fingers over the soft wool. Josie nodded. "I noticed your old one was getting threadbare." He wrapped it around his neck immediately, the blue bringing out the color of his eyes. "No one's made me something by hand since my mother died." "Thank you, Josie." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. Without thinking, she leaned forward and kissed his cheek. It was a simple gesture, meant to express gratitude and affection, but as she began to pull away, Jack's hand came up to cup her face. For a breathless moment, they stayed frozen in that position, his palm warm against her cheek, his eyes searching hers with a question she could read clearly. Slowly, deliberately, Josie nodded. The kiss, when it came, was gentle at first, tentative, exploring. But as Josie responded, it deepened, conveying months of unspoken feelings. His arms encircled her, drawing her closer, and she melted against him, her hands sliding up to his shoulders. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing unevenly. Jack rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I've been wanting to do that since the day you agreed to become my partner," he admitted. "Why didn't you?" she asked softly. "Wasn't sure you were ready. After losing your husband, I mean." He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze directly. "And I wasn't sure I deserved someone like you." Jack Kane, Josie said firmly, framing his face with her hands. You are the most honorable, hard-working, kind-hearted man I've ever known. Any woman would be fortunate to have your affection. He smiled then, a full, uninhibited smile that transformed his face. Is that so? He teased, gaining confidence. And what about you, Josie Valmont? Are you fortunate? In answer, she kissed him again, pouring all her emerging feelings into the connection. As winter deepened, so did their relationship. Jack and Josie continued their practical partnership, working side by side to maintain the ranch through the harsh Montana winter, but there was a new dimension to their interactions, now shared kisses by the fire, hands held while walking between cabins, conversations that touched on hopes and dreams for the future. By February, when the coldest part of winter held the valley in its grip, they had established a pattern of spending most evenings together at the main house, with Josie returning to her cabin to sleep. It was a compromise between propriety and their desire to be together, though both were finding the arrangement increasingly frustrating. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, making the half-mile trek to Josie's cabin impossible, they faced the situation head-on. You'll have to stay here tonight, Jack said, looking out at the wall of white beyond the windows. It's not safe to go out in this. Josie nodded, trying to appear calmer than she felt. I'll take the spare room. Jack stoked the fire, adding another log to ensure it would burn through the night. Josie, he said finally, his back still to her. I think we need to talk about what's happening between us. She took a deep breath. I agree. He turned to face her, his expression serious. I'm in love with you. I think I have been since I carried you out of that burning cabin. The words were simple, direct, so like him. I know it's been less than a year since you lost your husband, and I don't want to rush you, but I need you to know how I feel. Joy bloomed in Josie's chest, warm and expanding. Jack, I love you too. I've been afraid to admit it, afraid it was too soon after Thomas. But what I feel for you is real and true. He crossed to her then, taking her hands in his. I want to court you properly, Josie Valmont. And if you'll have me, I want to make you my wife. Tears of happiness filled her eyes. Yes, she whispered. Yes to both. Their kiss sealed the promise, tender and reverent. When they separated, Jack's eyes were suspiciously bright. I never thought I'd find this, he admitted. After the war, I was so lost. Coming west was a way to escape, to find someplace where no one knew what I'd done, what I'd seen. And did you find peace here? She asked. Not until you came, he said honestly. You brought light back into my life, Josie. Hope. A future worth building. She leaned against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. The fire that destroyed my home led me straight to you, she mused. Perhaps it was fate all along. That night, Josie slept in the spare room, but with a new sense of certainty about their future. They would court properly, respecting the memory of her first marriage while building the foundation for their own. And when the time was right, they would join their lives completely. Spring came early to Connors Valley that year. By mid-March, the snow was retreating, revealing patches of grass that grew greener by the day. Crocuses pushed through the still cold earth, and the creek ran high with melting snow from the mountains. Jack and Josie's courtship flourished alongside the awakening land. True to his word, Jack did things properly, bringing her wildflowers he found during his rounds, checking cattle, taking her on picnics when the weather allowed, even arranging a proper dinner at Silver Creek's hotel when they traveled to town for supplies. Word of their engagement spread quickly through the small community. Most reactions were positive, though Josie occasionally caught whispers about the speed of their relationship following her widowhood. But such concerns mattered little compared to the happiness she had found. By April, they had set a date for early June. Jane Bedford happily agreed to help with preparations, and Mrs. Jenkins offered to bake the wedding cake. The ceremony would be simple, held at Raven Ridge Ranch, with the local minister officiating, followed by a celebration with their small circle of friends and neighbors. As the wedding approached, Josie found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. Just over a year ago, she had been a grieving widow, struggling to maintain a failing homestead alone. Now she was part owner of a thriving small ranch, engaged to a man who valued her as an equal partner, surrounded by a community that had embraced her. The fire that had seemed like the end of everything had actually been a beginning. On the morning of their wedding day, Josie stood in her cabin, allowing Jane to help arrange her hair. She wore a new dress of pale blue, not traditional white, in deference to her previous marriage, but beautiful nonetheless, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. "You look radiant," Jane declared, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Jack won't know what hit him." Josie smiled, unable to contain her happiness. "I never expected to find love again, Jane. Especially not like this. Some people go their whole lives without finding what you and Jack have," her friend replied. "Second chances are rare and precious." A knock at the door announced Mrs. Jenkins's arrival. She entered carrying a small package. "A wedding gift, dear," she explained, "from all the neighbor ladies." Inside, Josie found a handmade quilt, each square contributed by a different woman from the surrounding homesteads. "It's tradition around here," Mrs. Jenkins explained. "Each family adds a piece of their own history to welcome a new bride to the community." Tears threatened to spill over as Josie traced the various patterns, some simple, others intricate, all stitched with care and goodwill. "It's the most beautiful gift I've ever received," she said honestly. "Please thank everyone for me." By noon, guests had begun to arrive at the ranch. Jack had transformed the area between the main house and barn into a festive space, with tables set up for the celebration to follow and wildflowers decorating every surface. Daniel Jenkins and his father had constructed a simple arbor where the ceremony would take place. Josie remained in her cabin until it was time, following another local tradition that the groom shouldn't see the bride until the actual ceremony. When Jane finally came to escort her, Josie felt a flutter of nervous excitement in her stomach. "Ready?" Jane asked with a knowing smile. "More than ready," Josie replied confidently. The walk to the arbor seemed both endless and instantaneous. Guests turned to watch her approach, faces smiling in approval, but Josie had eyes only for Jack. He stood waiting for her, more handsome than she had ever seen him, in a new black suit, his dark hair neatly combed, his blue eyes shining with emotion. As she reached him and placed her hand in his, he whispered, "You're beautiful, Josie." The ceremony itself was brief, but heartfelt. They exchanged simple vows and rings. Jack had surprised her with a delicate gold band purchased during his last trip to Silver Creek. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jack kissed her with such tenderness that several of the women in attendance dabbed at their eyes. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening. There was music from a fiddle player who lived up the valley, dancing on a wooden platform built specially for the occasion, and food contributed by everyone in attendance, a true community effort. As sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Jack led Josie away from the festivities to a quiet spot overlooking the valley. "Happy, Mrs. Kane?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Completely," she assured him, leaning back against his solid strength. "And you? More than I ever thought possible." He turned her in his arms, his expression suddenly serious. "I want you to know something, Josie. That day when I saw the smoke from your cabin, I almost didn't go investigate. I was in a hurry, heading to Silver Creek on business." He shook his head, as if still amazed by the coincidence. "If I'd been even 10 minutes later on the trail." She placed her finger against his lips. "But you weren't. You were exactly where you needed to be. And so was I." She smiled up at him. "Even if my cabin was on fire at the time." He laughed then, the sound free and joyous. When I saw you lying there in the smoke, I just reacted. Didn't think about the danger. All I knew was I had to get you out. Then I'll carry her through the smoke, Josie quoted softly. That's what you said. I heard you, even through the haze. And I'll keep carrying you, he promised, through whatever life brings us. As darkness fell over Raven Ridge Ranch, the newlyweds rejoined their guests for the final dances of the evening. Looking around at the smiling faces, the land that had become her home, and the man who now shared her life, Josie felt a profound sense of gratitude. From the ashes of loss had risen something beautiful, and enduring a love as vast as the Montana sky and as solid as the mountains that watched over their valley. 5 years later, Raven Ridge Ranch had grown from a modest operation to one of the most respected in the territory. Under Jack and Josie's joint management, they had expanded their herd, added sheep for wool, and developed one of the finest horse breeding programs in the region. Their personal happiness had expanded as well, with the birth of their son, Thomas Jackson Kane, now 3 years old, and their daughter, Elizabeth Rose, just learning to walk at 14 months. Their family cabin had been enlarged twice to accommodate their growing family, and Josie's original cabin now served as a comfortable guest house for the frequent visitors they hosted. On the anniversary of the fire that had brought them together, Jack and Josie made a point of riding out alone, leaving the children in Mrs. Jenkins's capable hands for a few hours. They would picnic on the ridge overlooking the valley, sharing memories and dreams for the future. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if your cabin hadn't caught fire that day? Jack asked as they sat side by side, watching the sunset. Josie considered the question, her hand finding his automatically. Sometimes. But then I think how that fire, as terrible as it seemed at the time, led me exactly where I was meant to be. Jack squeezed her hand, his wedding band catching the last rays of sunlight. I thank God every day for bringing you to me, even if it took a fire to do it. And I thank God for sending a stubborn cowboy to carry me through the smoke, Josie replied with a smile, leaning over to kiss her husband as the first stars appeared in the Montana sky.